So really today we're going to be talking about what's going on in the cyber marketplace, both from an insurance standpoint as well as from a technology standpoint. I've asked Troy, who leads Crowe's cyber practice, to join today's call. Troy will be able to introduce himself, but they are the 8th largest accounting firm in the country. Troy does run their cyber practice, and the reason why I've partnered with Troy on many matters is as we see more and more claims coming in, there seems to be more of a business interruption issue with respects to cyber claims, and being able to partner with an accounting firm like Crowe has been very meaningful with respects to the business interruption losses, being able to have somebody internally help quantify the technology issue as well as the business income loss. So 2020 has really been an interesting year, and I would say it was starting prior to this, really with regards to what was going on in the marketplace. We've seen COVID-19 obviously have a significant impact with respects to cyber risk. You know, we're all now remote. So think about it that we are connecting perhaps a personal printer to our corporate laptop. Perhaps your cell phone now, you're sharing, your personal email and your corporate email because it's just easier, right? Because we're all remote. Obviously, COVID has thrown things off significantly. We've seen a significant rise in the amount of ransomware attacks because of COVID. The FBI actually came out and said that there was a 600% increase from Q1 to Q2 with respects to phishing-related emails that have to do with a COVID type of headline. So hackers were opportunistic with this. Why are people buying cyber insurance? I would say it's really for 3 reasons. One, from a regulatory perspective. We're seeing a lot more regulations now in the US. New York has cyber regs, California has cyber regs, Chicago has cyber regs, and one would suspect that other states are going to follow. So we don't suspect that this is a trend that's going to be going away anytime soon. Secondly, from a privacy standpoint, the one that we've always talked about, right? You get hacked, you have to notify your clients, things of that nature. That's kind of the basic core piece of it. And then really the one that I would say is the most challenging, or the one that clients come to us and really ask for the most help on, is trying to quantify what the business income loss could be. So should we not be able to access our network or our system, perhaps we're not able to bill, perhaps we're going to miss a certain deadline or a certain filing date. And then perhaps how does that impact that particular insured or that particular client? Could there be a professional liability claim that's brought against us from a professional services standpoint if we missed a certain date, a tax filing date, a team, So just kind of thinking about the way that the professional liability and the cyber liability are really starting to blend together has been more so than we've ever seen. So what are we really seeing in the marketplace? The marketplace has changed dramatically. When I did this presentation 4 years ago for you all, I believe $250 million was the largest tower that some of the Fortune 1000 organizations were able to buy. We've now been able to put together $1 billion of cyber insurance premium for, you could figure which technology firm that it is, right? But so now you are starting to see capacity starting to rise within the marketplace. And why is that? 4 years ago, 5 years ago, you saw 60 carriers writing standalone cyber insurance policies. Now there's over 200 cyber insurance carriers trying to write cyber insurance policies. So what happened is there was a lot of supply in the marketplace and not necessarily a lot of demand. So you saw prices really dropping because there was so much competition. Now that we've seen actually a significant rise in claims this year, both in frequency and severity, rates are actually going up for the first time in the cyber insurance marketplace at a meaningful way. And we'll get to that in the next slide. We talk about here, and if you notice Q2 2020 on this particular slide, and I did that for a reason, because I didn't want to just calculate what the COVID related losses were. I wanted you to see where the marketplace was trending really before COVID losses were starting to take into effect. We were starting to see actually a rate increase about of 4% on an average risk. I'm sorry, 7% on an average risk, and it was 4% on the median. What the marketplace is talking about. So cyber insurance has always been one of the least expensive line items on an insurance policy, on a risk management policy, right? So you have workers' comp, general liability, auto, directors and officers, crime, right? Cyber is usually the least expensive or one of the least expensive line items on that policy. I don't think that's going to be the case going forward. I've had 4 conversations with 4 of our largest carriers, and I wasn't going to call any particular one out. But you are starting to see on clean risks 10% increases just across the board. Some of them are willing to go up to 25% increases on a clean risk. Should you actually have that incident during that time period, you could be looking at a 50 or 60% increase in the cyber insurance marketplace, given what's going on. Now, it's not just cyber that's trending upwards. It's really all lines. And I would say the line of coverage that is taking the stance of hardening the quickest from a pricing standpoint is directors and officers. Directors and officers is becoming a very challenging class of business, most notably public D&O. Prior to COVID in 2020, they said that the SEC, they were expecting 1 in 10 private companies to have some type of SEC enforcement action over the course of 2020. Clearly, because of COVID, those numbers were clearly changed and manipulated a little bit. But effectively, the marketplace hasn't changed, and the marketplace has only gotten worse for directors and officers insurance. Somebody that was paying $10,000 last year with a $10,000 deductible may be paying $20,000 this year with a $20,000 deductible. It's just the way that the marketplace is going. So what I would strongly recommend is, from a P&L standpoint, this is probably one area from your insurance, from your clients' spend where you could probably make a meaningful difference. The directors and officers is just going off the charts. So if you saw, D&O, we were seeing about a 50% increase. Cyber, we're seeing about a 7% increase. So I'm just trying to give you some perspective. So who's buying this stuff, right? So 2014, when we joined, 2014, when we started surveying Marsh McLennan clients and who was really buying the book, who's buying cyber insurance, only about 20% of our clients were currently procuring it. When we did this last year, we've now actually doubled our book. But when you still think about it, the largest insurance broker in the world, dealing with some of the most sophisticated organizations in the world, that only 42% of our clients currently are buying standalone cyber insurance. It means almost, it's a significant amount that are still not procuring this. And then if you go down into the middle market, those numbers are extrapolated even more. So what are we seeing from a claim standpoint? Ransomware, and more ransomware, both from a frequency and a severity standpoint. As you see, the amount of claims that we're seeing is escalating significantly. But what's almost as concerning, or if not more concerning, is on the left-hand chart, you see that absolute spike in the amount of ransom or the demand that the hacker or the adversary is demanding before they let go of your system. So, before it used to be a $10,000, request, a $25,000 request, and it would be a business decision that oftentimes a middle market organization would be able to, foot the bill and pay that demand. Now we're seeing the average demands is over 175,000. That's a real business decision that we need to identify if we're going to transfer that to an insurance company or if we're going to retain that risk, because this is a business decision that is coming up. And should that decision come up on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, you don't want to start having that roundtable conversation with leadership. You want to be able to identify this ahead of time. So that's why when we talk, best practices, I really enjoy working with Troy, because we need to think about these kind of the post-breach strategy prior to the incident happening. Reason being, as we see, business interruption claims are spiking. And the reason why they're spiking is the longer that we wait, or the more that there's indecisiveness, as soon as we find out that there's an incident, the longer that we could be out of business. So the quicker that we could get back up and running, the less the business interruption loss may be. So again, it's the same thing that we have planning for a fire drill. We want to make sure that we're now planning for our cyber drill. This just basically talks about the Ponemon Institute. If you do put in some of these safeguards that Troy will talk about, it is very meaningful from a dollars and cents standpoint. Roughly about $2 million can be saved for a middle market organization should they have a data incident and they do take some of these safeguards in place, like creating incident response plans, doing vulnerability scans, penetration tests, so on and so forth. I'll leave off with this. The insurance marketplace has gotten a lot more complicated with respects to cyber, right? Because it's touching on so many different lines of coverage. So now we need to start to understand how you're running your manufacturing business. And is that manufacturing business truly a manufacturer and we're underwriting them as a manufacturer, or are they truly an Internet of Things manufacturer and we need to consider them as a tech E&O risk? The way that the policies are currently being written, property policies have silent cyber exclusions, which effectively will say if there's a fire because of a cyber incident, there may be coverage or there may not be coverage. What we like to do is have affirmative coverage, either non-affirmative or affirmative coverage, be on the property policy. So it's, again, just a quick way to help advise your clients. The other piece that I would leave off is coordinating the cyber and the crime. We're seeing a significant amount of fraudulent wire transfers, fake invoice manipulation, things of that nature. And oftentimes it may be better covered under the crime policy than it would the cyber policy. So hence the reason why we suggest taking really a holistic approach when we're taking a look at, a firm's cyber risk perspective. With that being said, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Troy Lahise.
Thanks, Mark. Are you able to give me the ability to advance the slides?
You know what? I will end the slideshow and then see if you can.
I could just share my own screen.
Yep.
I do not have. You cannot share screen while the other. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Hopefully you are seeing a new presentation.
Yes.
Okay.
You are.
Awesome. We have a group of such a size that I'm comfortable if you want to inject questions as I go along. So I'll try to pause frequently if there's anything that I say that you guys want to comment on or dig into further. Otherwise, I think we'll have time at the end. So Neil and board, thank you very much for the opportunity to be in front of this group. My name is Troy Lahise. As Mark mentioned, I lead Crowe's digital security practice. And that's a practice that runs a lot of different things, as Mark had mentioned, pre-breach, post-breach, assessment work. It's a very busy and exciting time for us these days. And I want to talk really about three different things. I want to give a perspective of what we've seen now that we're at the end of 2020, the impact that 2020 is having on our business. Talk a little bit about cybersecurity challenges, give you a perspective that you may not have seen before from a technology standpoint of exactly what's happening during a breach. Talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing, and then spend more of the time talking about how organizations can become more cyber resilient. And that'll wrap up our conversation for today. So from our perspective, 2020 has had a dramatic impact, not just on the cybersecurity landscape, but technology in general, and the way that it really impacts our people, our businesses, our clients. A lot of organizations have modified the way that they operate as a result of the pandemic. And that is a great thing for advancing technology. It has changed a little bit. It has taught people how to interact differently. We've introduced new technologies. Microsoft 365 has seen a dramatic increase over 2020, as well as some other platforms like Zoom. And for the most part, what we've seen is people have adapted pretty well. It was a little rocky in March and April, and we were concerned generally about how people would increase the risk from a cybersecurity standpoint. And as Mark mentioned, there is certainly some things that we're seeing increase. The ransomware payment requests are increasing, but overall, I don't think that we are seeing yet a dramatic spike in successful attacks the way that we anticipated or people anticipated back in the springtime. But there may still be some fallout from this, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Many organizations were on some path of digital transformation, and what we saw was there's really two different things that happened in the spring. One is that some organizations accelerated that digital transformation because it made sense for them to do so. Others put that on pause, and they put a lot of other things on pause too, to be able to respond and move their entire network and their people's ability to work from home and make everything mobile. So that we're starting to see some of that come back around now, and organizations that had hit the pause button on some of these advances on their strategy and their digital transformation are now slowly making plans for 2021 to pick that back up. One of the impacts that we're seeing is on our customers, and I think I'd be curious what you're seeing with your customers. But we are definitely, at first there was this reaction of, well, how are we going to do this? And then it very quickly changed to a lot of customers in all industries are saying, all right, I'm on board with working or interacting remotely. And I've actually got some demands now that I've been doing this for a few months. And the expectation of service providers, financial institutions, other B2C companies, or even B2B companies, those demands are being led by customers getting more comfortable with this atmosphere, that we may not see much of a pullback from this, even when we're able to meet face to face. Whether it's because of the pandemic or not, what we're seeing in 2020 is a significant increase in the capability of threat actors around social engineering. And this is probably why Mark what Mark had shown us, that 60% increase in ransomware, moving from $10,000 to $175,000. That's because these threat actors are much more sophisticated even than they were a year ago, and we're seeing indications that that's going to continue to increase, which is not great for the rest of us. This is being coupled with, I think, some new challenges or some increasing challenges we're seeing in cybersecurity. It continues to rise. I don't know if I'm going to see anything in the next 10 years where I won't be able to put a statistic out there that says cybersecurity fraud and abuse is rising year over year. What I think will change is what motivates the threat actors. Still largely motivated by financial means, getting that money, ransomware, but we are starting to see ideological motivations, simply wanting to shut an organization down for a period of time, or stealing trade secrets, but not directly looking for a payout in the moment. There's an increasing shift to a motivation that is something larger than an immediate payout. One thing that is holding steady is how long it takes for an organization to realize they've been breached. And this is another leading factor towards why threat actors are being more successful in getting those higher ransomware payments, is because they're spending on average 11 months inside an organization before an organization realizes they're there. That's a lot of time to gather the necessary information or a chokehold on the network that allows them to request such a high payment. What we're seeing is a majority of the cases, phishing is involved, and that's the entry point. So a lot of organizations are doing a great job with antivirus, firewalls, all these technologies that are available are working, but the back door is individuals, as employees. It's those phishing attempts that allow a threat actor to get in the organization and then kind of persist. And I'll show an example of that in just a second. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to cybersecurity, and there's just so many factors involved that it can get a little bit mind-numbing, and especially for smaller organizations, you just kind of want to throw your hands up in the air and say, well, there's really not much I can do because there's so much for me to do, and there's some validity to that. And the reason is that there are a number of controls that need to be put in place to fully secure an organization. And if any one of those fails, you're at risk. I'll walk you through what we see as a typical breach situation. I would say over 70% of the successful breaches that we see follow a pattern similar to this. And it starts, as I mentioned, with phishing. Usually they find any one of individuals and their broadcasting these broadly. They're not discriminating size of organization, industry. They're looking for anybody that they can who will click through and provide their credentials. And when that happens, that gives them immediate access. There are ways to prevent this: stronger employee training, multi-factor authentication, better password management, stronger passwords. But at the end of the day, the strongest password doesn't really matter if you're willingly giving that to a threat actor through one of these phishing attempts. So what happens here is once they gain access, they're what we call very, very quiet on the network. They will sit on the network for weeks or months and not make any activity, not make any noise. And what we're seeing now actually is a trend where one threat actor will get onto the network, sit there, and then go to the black market and sell that access to the highest bidder. So they'll say, I've gotten into this organization, here's some details on it, and it's like an auction where they'll auction off that level of access. Once they feel comfortable, they start to do reconnaissance, which is a very light noise activity across the network. What they're looking for is to understand how big the network is, what type of sensitive data might be there. They're watching your traffic go back and forth to see who you're interacting with. They're generally trying to figure out how big of a prize could this be. Then they generally don't get lucky enough to gain access immediately in what we call a privileged situation, someone with administrator rights or someone who can really traverse the entire network. So their next goal is to try to figure out how to increase their escalation or increase their privileges. It's a generally easy process once they're in the organization, but their goal is to get to the administrative level so that they can access all areas of the network. From there, then, they do access all areas of the network. They identify where your key files are. They basically set their game plan for how they want to capture the sensitive information on your network, or what's going to lead to ultimately the ransomware or the theft of data. And then they go after it. And this process is usually pretty quick once they've gone through these other phases. This is usually at the tail end of that process where they're accessing the data. They're probably trying to encrypt the data, and eventually that leads to either an exfiltration of that, which is removing that from the network and placing it in the black market and selling that, or this is at the point where they say, okay, this is what I have, and this is what I want in return for what I have. It's a fairly standard process, but the way that these organizations are so successful is that they take that, they're very, very patient, and that's why that statistic of 11 months rings true. Any questions or thoughts so far?
Yeah, I have a question. Why is it that our antivirus and firewalls aren't catching these things? Or at least picking them up the next week afterwards? Sooner or later, these companies should be monitoring and deleting these files.
Yep. Great question. So there's probably two reasons why they are not ultimately successful. One is they're not configured properly. So just having an antivirus or firewall does not necessarily mean that it is configured precisely to your organization. It may be wide open, and so it doesn't identify anomalies in the traffic necessarily. And there's a trade-off, right? So the more rules that you set, the more restrictions you place on yourself or your employees to conduct business. And so there's that balance, and striking that balance is really difficult for a lot of organizations. So they lean on leaving that a little bit more open, and that's where the threat actors thrive. The other reason is these individuals generally are very sophisticated. These people it's a craft, it's a specialization. They don't have, this isn't Matthew Broderick, right? In war games, this isn't a side job. This isn't something they do at their lunchtime. This is something they're doing 12 hours a day. And it's not just them. The other thing is and what's really interesting and scary is we're seeing collusion amongst threat actors. We see this over and over again, but the first time I saw it was a few years ago, where we saw a attack, and it was a ransomware. The malware that was placed into the organization had a fingerprint from a Russian threat actor organization, but there were indications that it was that the actual threat actors that were involved were from New Jersey. And so what it told us, and we were able to dig through, we have access to some pretty interesting information ourselves. What we're able to identify is that the New Jersey syndicate was either working actively with the Russian individuals, or they simply purchased the technology that was available and used that in combination with their own skills. So these guys are not individually working. There's a whole network of these individuals and groups that's really quite sophisticated. So once they get in, that patience and that capability does allow them to even navigate in some of the best designed networks. I mean, you can, Equifax, what am I thinking of? Starwood and Marriott, Experian, a lot of these big names that have all of this money and are putting all of these resources towards this are still falling victim.
Is there better antivirus software? Is there some that's better than others? What are you finding out there? I mean, it has to change and adapt as well, correct? Right.
So Symantec, Trend Micro, I'm not blanking up, McAfee, all of these work really well. And as long as you're continuously refreshing and pulling down the latest updates, which is usually daily, sometimes more frequently than daily, you're generally as good as you're going to get. There are some others that I didn't mention that are still effective, but to say that there's one that's dramatically better than the other, they're all pretty even in the top 5. It's a matter of whether you have the right rule set identified and implemented, and whether you're continuously updating that rule set.
I noticed you didn't mention Norton. Is there a reason for that?
Symantec, yeah.
Oh,
yep.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Yeah.
So equally is good.
I know we recently hired an outside firm I think Larry did as well.
Yep.
To really monitor this and my big fears, as a small business, is that, once everybody went remote, I know I'm using my best practices, but
yep.
I don't have my eyes on my employees every day.
Exactly.
And that's my biggest fear, is as everybody's remote and what their surroundings are and what's going on with their computers is become a major task to say, are we doing the right thing? So the big fear.
Very real concern as well.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the things you can do. I painted maybe a little bit of a dire picture there, which I don't want it to be all doom and gloom. I think there are a lot of things that you can do to protect yourself. And I want to walk through a handful of those things that we're working with a number of organizations to put into place or to enhance. So the first thing is really understanding what it is you're trying to protect. And this makes a lot of sense for larger organizations because there is so much that is there that they can't possibly protect it all at the same level. But I think it's still applicable to smaller organizations because awareness is the first step to understanding what it is and how to best protect that. So real quickly, the first thing is to really understand what is of value if someone were to take it from you, and how attractive is that information? How valuable could that be? And then this is a little more challenging for organizations, smaller organizations, especially without a lot of technology resources, but to think about who threatens you. What type of threat actor would be interested in this. And for a lot of organizations, this step is pretty generic. They say, okay, well, any threat actor would be interested in this. Larger organizations, it gets a little bit trickier when you start thinking about ideological motivations and espionage. The third area is probably something most organizations look to a third party to help them with is well, what are your vulnerabilities? How can, if you know what you have and what you're trying to protect, how could somebody threaten that? How can somebody gain access to that? And there's a lot of inexpensive ways that third parties can perform those penetration tests or some other form of assessment to give you a picture of exactly how exposed you might be. And then you can consider what are the steps you're taking to defend yourself with those vulnerabilities in mind. It's a fairly straightforward process, but a lot of organizations don't step back to kind of think about that in such elemental terms. With that in mind, and this might be a little bit of a stretch for small businesses, you can apply a framework, and there's a lot of different frameworks out there, NIST being probably one of the most commonly used these days. ISO also has a pretty robust framework to guide you in what you and how you want to protect your organization. For those of you that are working with third parties, I'd be interested, or it might be a good question for them, is to ask them, you know, what frameworks guide their decision making and the steps that they take to help protect your organization. If it's not on this list, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but I think it would be a good exercise for you to get a little bit of comfort that there is some type of a formal framework that they're adopting to apply to your security. With that in mind, the next thing to do is really understand, well, how much do I care? You know, some organizations may go through that first step and say, I don't really have that much that I care about, or I feel pretty comfortable with it, but I'm certainly not going to spend $100,000 a year to protect this. I have to define for myself, what's my risk appetite? What am I willing to spend? And what measures am I willing to take for myself and my employees, and balance that with the risk that you've identified of a cybersecurity attack and how it can impact your business. This is a little bit trickier for some organizations, but it does help you, I think, create a roadmap or some guide rails for how you want to manage your cybersecurity program going forward. I'm not going to read this, but I think you guys will have access to the deck, so you can certainly come back and look at this as an example of what a risk appetite could look like and help guide your decision making around your cybersecurity program. So then, of course, now with all this in mind, you can make the decisions on investing where it matters. There's a really cool set of tools that are in the marketplace today that help organizations do a very formal assessment of the risks and identify not only what could be appropriate levels of cybersecurity insurance for them, but also make that business decision a little bit easier in providing a return on investment for future or in expanding your, cybersecurity, your cybersecurity program. They range in price from $10,000 to $15,000 up to $150,000 for an annual subscription. So it's not for everybody. But elements of these tools, and Marc's team actually uses some of these tools. So there's potentially access to some of this information through different channels. But know that information is out there today, and for those that choose it, it's a pretty robust way to align your cybersecurity program to your risk appetite. A couple little sidebars here. For those of you that are in the cloud or moving into the cloud, there's a ton of advantages to this for organizations of all sizes, yet it does come with a little bit of risk. And the cloud in and of itself is a highly secure environment, and moving to the cloud is an advantage on a number of levels. Like anything else, it's all about how you do it. And if done correctly, it can be a significant plus for an organization, but there are a number of things that need to be considered in that process that kind of outline that on the bottom below. Are there any individuals on the call today that are moving to the cloud or thinking about moving to the cloud?
We've moved to the cloud a while ago.
Okay.
I'm in the act of doing that.
Yeah.
Okay. And is this in terms of moving your entire infrastructure into the cloud?
Well, it's against my better judgment, but my partner and many of the other people here think that the way we're going, we ultimately going to end up on the cloud, so might as well implement it starting in January.
Right.
So when you say infrastructure, I'm assuming that means my servers rather than replacing them. We're going to probably go on wherever that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were
in the clouds too.
Yeah. We were
I used
kind
to
of forced
represent-
to.
I used to represent these co-location organizations. Basically, they were the cloud.
Yeah.
And that may be the reason why I'm nervous.
Well, we've got big names that are running these clouds, right? Microsoft, IBM, Cisco, Amazon. Maybe those aren't good names to you, but it is a significant advantage for small businesses, I think, because it takes away a lot of expense. And if you trust those names, there's a lot of advantage to being in the cloud. The question is whether you trust those names, but there is still some risk, and that's similar back to the question about, well, why isn't my antivirus and my firewall working? A lot of it has to do with how you make that shift into the cloud, and there's some very good out-of-the-box security that's probably good for 50-60% of all organizations. Never have to think twice about using the out-of-the-box security. And then there's another, group of that have to make some minor tweaks, and there's another group, larger organizations, that have to overlay another set of security on top of that to maintain security. So it's a great thing. It just should be. I would recommend working with your third-party provider to make sure that you feel comfortable that the level of security that you have being on-prem or in a colo is the same level of security you'll be getting when you're in the cloud. The other thing that's bubbling up these days is this concept of zero trust. And this is really having a dramatic impact on an organization, a successful impact on organizations in combating cybersecurity or the spread of a threat actor once they enter the network. So as I laid out earlier, that process where they gain access to the network, they sit there for a while, they try to escalate their privileges, and then once they escalate their privileges, they're off to the races. Zero trust is intended to impede their ability to escalate their privileges by limiting the access that individuals have to only exactly what they need. And so this concept is not necessarily new, but in 2020, it really exploded. As we moved everyone remotely, there was a sense that we want to get a little tighter controls around what these individuals have access to. If in the case, and I don't know if I think it was Lawrence that said, I'm nervous about what they're doing. I can't see them all the time. Well, one way to combat that is to limit their access to only what they need. Therefore, if their credentials are stolen, the ability for that threat actor to use that to escalate is severely limited. So it's one of the better controls that are advancing through this pandemic. So managing your risk is really the key, and there's just two more steps here. All right. You have, as I alluded to earlier, there are a lot of people out there today that make a business out of cyber attacks. Some are bit players, very small individuals, and there are very large, sophisticated organizations all the way up to nation states. Generally, I don't think that any of you are at risk of being a victim of a nation state attack, but there's a lot of players in between and below that aren't really concerned about who you are, where you are, what you stand for. They just want to know if they can get a couple dollars out of you, or as Mark indicated, $175,000 out of you. There are a lot of different things that can be done to manage this risk. Some of those we've already talked about, the firewall, antivirus. Some of them are much more fundamental and aren't as expensive as purchasing a new technology. Like implementing zero trust can be a very expensive endeavor for large organizations, but it can be a less expensive endeavor for you because you can implement it by policy. Identity and access management. Most of you have some form of a tool, whether it's Active Directory or some other tool that's used today to help you manage who has access and how they have access. Those tools are advancing to give you that capability to be more limiting in what you're providing without incurring a lot of expense. Awareness and training is probably the number one thing that doesn't cost a lot of money for organizations to help themselves. They're probably the best service out there right now for small to medium-sized organizations is a company called KnowBe4. KnowBe4 is a very low cost training and phishing education tool that you can use to test your employees and their ability to identify a phishing attempt. Because again, that's probably one of the most likely ways that a threat actor will get into your organization. And there's a lot of other things that my suspicion is that your third parties are helping monitoring and logging, looking at data management and protection. But it's a complex interaction of many different things that need to happen. With all of that in mind, there is still that possibility that you are going to be breached. And I think I would recommend that every organization spend some time, and this is really low cost activities, to be prepared in the case of a breach. Having a policy seems like a compliance activity around what are you going to do in the case of a breach. But we find time and time again, organizations that have a defined policy, have a defined procedure, are much more capable of minimizing the impact of an attack than those that do not. Being organized, knowing that there's a playbook there that you can turn to can be the difference between the $10,000 ransomware, $175,000 ransomware, because the more time that goes by, the worse that it is for you. A lot of organizations in 2020 have increased their simulations. This is probably because their business continuity plans were tested back in the spring in a number of different ways. And so that caused them to reflect on, well, what are all the other crises that could impact us? And exactly how do we know how we're prepared to respond? We call these tabletop exercises. For a lot of organizations, they're 2 to 8 hours where they get the key individuals, third parties into a room and say, okay, let's simulate this form of likely attack on the organization. And let's make sure everyone knows what their role is in preventing that. For small organizations who rely on third parties for information security, information technology, or even breach response, this is a really important activity because the number one thing that we find is there's a significant disconnect between the multiple parties as to who is doing what. And that's not something you want to figure out during a live breach. Couple more things. Advanced pen testing, penetration testing is a technique that a lot of companies follow to simulate the attack, to actually say, okay, we're going to pretend we're a bad actor and we're going to try to break into your organization, and then we're going to tell you how we did it so you can plug those holes, so to speak. And then the last thing, absolutely free, develop your crisis management team. Make sure that you know who the people are that are going to be around that table if the situation ever occurs where you're the victim of a breach. That is what I have for today. I kind of blew through the last few things, but questions or comments?
Troy, I have one.
Yep.
Would you recommend changing credentials on a maybe quarterly or semi-annual basis so that if somebody does get into the system, they get blocked off at some point?
Yeah, so I would recommend changing credentials every 3 weeks, every
Oh, wow.
3 to 4 weeks. Now, and I'm talking about for an individual. So if you're not changing your password every 3 to 4 weeks, that's easily a great thing that you can do that won't cost you any money, and it should apply to all of your employees. I would also recommend or consider stronger passwords, because there's still a lot of brute force attacks that are occurring, that people are using password cracking tools that can cycle through passwords incredibly fast. And so what we're seeing is a trend towards passphrases instead of passcodes. Not everybody loves these, but instead of having a passcode that is fall 2021 #, it would be, I enjoy watching leaves fall 2020 #. So it's a sentence that is easy to remember for the individual, but it has so many more characters that it's more difficult for the password cracking tools to be successful. There's some limitations. Some technologies don't allow for more than 16 characters, so it's not a perfect solution. The other thing that I would recommend, if for standard users, for your admin users, definitely they need to have a higher level of passwords. Like if your standard is 8-character minimum, they should have a 16-character minimum. But they should also, you should also consider multi-factor authentication for those individuals, so that they have to have more than a password to get onto the network and to make any changes. I would also consider multi-factor authentication for your standard users. It's not practical for every organization, but it really is a fantastic tool, because if the threat actors steal your password, or if you willingly give it to them, that's only one of the keys, right? They need both of the keys. And that's why we're seeing a surge in organizations that are implementing MFA. If you're on Office 0365, there's a built-in capability for MFA that's fairly easy to execute.
All right, I found this very informative.
Great. Any other questions?
I will point out that I am now just as terrified of cybersecurity breaches as I was before, but at least a little better informed.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. No, my biggest fear came when I had to go off, out of the facility and had people who have working for me at their homes, because God knows what's going through their, their home office or home internet interface, whether or not they are firewall protected. We tried to do it, but it scares me.
Right. And everybody's got different software and different stuff, and you don't see, and
Right, it's their modems.
I had somebody come to my
worry about
house
that.
actually and really assess every little electronic instrument I got, and really did a great assessment and said, okay, this, it wasn't major changes, it wasn't major money, but it was major protection. And he's going to go to my employee's house and do the same thing, because we're working from home.
Yeah.
So we don't know what we don't know. And, we're running multiple phone lines and multiple computers, and,
Neil, to your point, and what Troy kind of wrapped up on is, not everything is very expensive to implement, right? I mean, sometimes it's just a minor cultural change, and sometimes it's the hardest part to actually overcome. But if we can change the culture of the organization, oftentimes you'll be able to get them to be a much better risk prior than not necessarily appreciating the exposure.
Well, the Department of Financial Services, for those in my field, if there's a breach, there's a fine of $250,000 a day right now if you don't have a cybersecurity plan in place, and that would bankrupt me very quickly.
Yeah.
I don't know how many days that would go on, but that's nothing I can afford. And I got to tell you,
after 6 or 7 years, I'd run out of money.
Right. Well, we,
What was that daily fine, Neil?
I'm
Daily.
sorry,
How much was that dollar amount on a daily basis?
$250,000 a day is what
That's
they're
what I
saying.
thought you said. Wow.
And they keep coming up with these cybersecurity policies that, you know, do you have it? Do you have it on file? Do you have this? Do you have that? And if you don't answer correctly, they're, you know, and you get targeted by them, or there's a breach. And I got to tell you, in the middle of this year, June 3rd, I got very panicky because one of the major services that do all the, I'd say about 50% of the ordering of APS information, which is doctor's notes where they need the person's date of birth and social security, went out of business and didn't say anything to anybody. Oh, because of COVID, we're losing money. And then boom, gone. I said, they must have had a data breach, which
Yeah.
I think half of the United States was exposed, and it just kind of poofed into the night. I
Hmm.
mean, that's the first thing I thought of, because how do you just do that? You know,
You have to worry about filter down.
there's leaks all over the place, you know, and I know it, you know, so. Leaks, so, thank you, it's very appropriate. I wish we had a much larger audience for you.
Yeah.
Due to time of year, I think we had limited attendance of our typical meetings, and we hope you guys can come back and join the LIFPN, either as members or just, you know, we have a lot of different topics we cover. And of course, this is extremely vital and very much appreciated. And this is being recorded, so for reference for you guys to use, and we will follow up. So
Not just
thanks
you
again.
guys, we're going to point out to the people in the organization that they have full access to these recorded meetings.
Right.
So from time to time, someone calls up with an issue. Hey, why don't you go back and look at this?
Right.
All right.
Excellent.
In the meantime, thank you everyone for showing up.
Thank you.
And have
Have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody. Thanks again.
Take care, all. Bye-bye.
Bye.